right, friends, Greg Koukl here for Stand to Reason. So glad you've joined me today. We have a really strange show coming up here because I have two guests with me, and they both have the same name. I have with me Jim Wallace and Jim Wallace. Or more technically, J. Warner Wallace, who you all know as the author of Cold Case Christianity et al., and his son, I'm just going to call him Jimmy, to keep them separate. And gentlemen, and using that term very loosely here, thanks for joining me today.
Boy, you sound like you know us. Yeah, you sound like, to use it that loosely means you must know who we really are, right?
So look at Jimmy, one thing I have to say about you. No, Jimmy's the boy, the son. And Jay Warner, or Jim, is dad, okay? The old guy and the young guy, both cops. Their father and grandfather were cops. They're all kind of doing the deal. And we know a lot about you, Jimmy, because your dad talks about you a lot in virtually every single presentation he gives. He works you in there some way, so you're kind of infamous to the crowd. Not so much to my listeners, but certainly to me and anybody who listens to J. Warner Wallace. So we'll have you on anyway. Glad to talk with you. And this is a unique situation because I'm at a little bit of loss here, Jim, as J. Warner, because I've never done an interview about a comic book before.
Yeah, and that's interesting to me and I totally get it. And you and I were talking over the weekend. We were doing the last of all these reality conferences for this season. We were in Dayton, Ohio. That was a really interesting experience. That's our first time in Dayton. So here we are. It was huge. I thought it was really well attended, considering that these folks had never seen this kind of conference before. Right. And of course, that gives us a lot of time. We can kind of hang out and talk about things. And I think it is interesting that you and I, we read a lot, and we are reading. What are we reading? Well, most of the time, I'm not a great fiction reader. I'm always studying for something, or preparing for the next book, or researching something. And the kind of work that we do as detectives, you're always looking at these facts, these evidences that you're gathering together, right? And so it does feel like it's a lot of research, and that's been our lives. Now, interestingly, though. Often, if we're going to go out with our wives or going to have an evening off, we're probably watching something. Often, we're watching something streaming or watching a movie. So, like, fiction has a place for us, but for you and I, at least, we are devoted to our nonfiction research, and we just knew that that Christianity is an apple that we can bite from a couple different angles, and you almost need to, because these different approaches produce different kinds of results. So I can make a case for Christianity in 5 steps or 10 steps, or whatever you want to do. And that's great for some people. They need you to make that case. But when we write fiction, we take them on a journey. And often the journey, not to say that there's any parallel here, but you saw that Lewis would do this, where he would write his books that chronicle the evidence and the worldview and make brilliant observations about that. And then he would also write fiction that teases out some of the same ideas, but does in a different way. And I think we really I've always wanted to do both. But to be honest, the better fiction writer of the two of us is Jimmy. So just the fact I can partner with him. And you know why that is? It's because behind him right now on the wall, as you're looking at our monitor, you can see all of his thousands of comic books alphabetized. And I think if you're not a good reader of fiction, especially in the genre that you're trying to write in, well, good luck writing it. You need to be a good reader in the genre in which you're trying to write. And so he really understood this genre and has now, I think, crafted something really powerful.
So I mentioned, kind of jokingly, tongue-in-cheek, comic book, but strictly speaking, this is a graphic novel. It's a serious work. And Jimmy, I didn't know the role that you play here. Why don't you bring us up to speed on how you happen to get roped into this project with your dad. I know you're heavily involved with Cold Case Christianity, the website, and he's kind of deeded that over to you, and you manage a lot of that work so he can be grandpa, and occasionally come out and do some speaking for us. But how did you get roped into this particular project?
I would say that my dad is still pretty much 99.99999% of Cold Case Christianity, but I'm happy to kind of tag along at any type of ministry venture. I think, if anything, I roped him into this. So I think that to keep it quick, to tell my little story, is that I grew up the son of a cop and the son of an apologist, and those two things really rubbed off on me. Growing up, I listened to my dad tell stories of his exciting police adventures, and that made me want to be in law enforcement, which eventually I did, and I still work for the same agency that he worked for. But I also grew up constantly surrounded by him and his friends talking and often arguing about apologetics and all types of theological topics, and that really made me view Christianity through this lens that Christianity is all about finding the truth of the matter, taking things very seriously, and kind of almost competing or combating differing ideas about God together to figure out where the truth lies. And that's kind of how the film, or the prism through which I saw Christianity. But there was one thing, maybe only one thing in my life that is different than my dad, and that's that I grew up loving comic books. And yes, we'll say it's a graphic novel. I'm happy calling it a comic book. It is what it is. A graphic novel is simply just a really long comic book.
Yeah, a very thick one. Yeah, that's right. Well, that's great.
Try to have a little bit nicer paper, a little bit nicer cover. And for me, I knew the impact that comics had on me throughout my life. As a kid, I read more family-friendly type comics, Spider-Man and the X-Men and these kind of superheroes. But even those stories taught these moral lessons about needing to be sacrificial, that being sacrificial is more important than getting what you wanted, that if you were a good person, you looked out for others. And that really influenced the trajectory of my life just as much, or maybe alongside my faith. I wouldn't say instead of my faith, but what it was is that in the Bible, I would read these stories that told me I should be sacrificial. And some of them were stories, and some of them are like the letters of Paul, where we're just kind of, it is sort of that nonfiction kind of genre. Then I'd read Spider-Man, and I'd see it lived out in the lives of these characters who were struggling with, I know I'm supposed to be sacrificial, but often that doesn't work for me. I don't want that. Yeah. And so that made me realize that fiction made me feel or experience the truths I was seeing in my faith in a different way. And so I think I always knew the power of fiction, and as I grew up, I just looked for more age-appropriate stories, but still in the comic book genre. And I still read plenty of them today and enjoy them. And so when this opportunity to do something together in the comic book space came along, it was kind of like a dream opportunity for me.
Well, your dad, I was with him last weekend, and so we're checking into the hotel. What was it, 12:30, 12:45 in the morning?
Yeah.
And I don't know how we got into that, but he gets into it with the gal, Mary Catherine. Remember her name?
Yes.
I do.
Yes.
Mary Catherine. And it was really sweet, but your dad was pretty aggressive. And bang, bang, bang. Well, here's what we're doing. We're all part of this group. And then, man, he sees an opening. He's asking her questions and carrying on. And I'm the bump on the log, sitting there next to him while he's carrying on with her as we're both registering in. So, yeah, he's a can-do kind of guy when it comes to these things. It was a lot of fun. I think he wanted Mary Catherine to come to the conference, which she wasn't. And I didn't see her the rest of the weekend.
I know, I didn't either.
She went away and hid somewhere after that. I don't know. But what you said, I asked you how you got roped into this, and you said that you kind of roped your dad into this. By the way, Jay Warner, you were talking about background. So I'm looking at your background, and you got all these things on the wall, all these pictures and what do you call them, commendations, and all these hats and whatever. There's Mr. Cold Case there, and here you are in your garage, Jimmy, with all these boxes. But the boxes are comic books, so those are a different type of trophy, that really, really lends itself to this project that you engaged in. And let me just kind of give it some an official title here. It's called Case Files, Volume 1, Murder and Meaning. I think your last book, Jay Warner, was Truth and True Crime. Is that right?
That's
yeah,
right.
You talked about that over the weekend to the young people. It's amazing. I got choked up 3 times. I've heard it 3 times so far this year, and I still got choked up. It was so powerful. And I have a hint from looking at the PDF of the new book that there's a theme from that talk that's also developed here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. By the way, I'm just going to hit you up publicly. I don't like reading this kind of stuff online, so you got to send me a hard copy of your thick comic book
Yes,
at
it's
my
coming.
home, so I'll get through it. Hey, my daughters might even
they might read it
too.
first.
Yeah, my wife might even read it. Who knows?
Yeah.
But so how is it? Did you come? I know your dad. Just knowing him all these years, that he had a couple. He said, like, I got 2 books in me that are nonfiction, and he makes 4 or 5 or 6. And but he said, I got some novels in me too. I want to pursue that. Just kind of for fun. And now he's got this graphic novel, but you were apparently the stimulus for this enterprise. Tell us how that all started.
Well, it was I would say fortuitous, but I think it's all in God's timing. We had already been talking about trying to do a project together. I think that was like a dream of mine, to do something with my dad in ministry. Obviously, I've done a little bit with Cold Case Christianity, but we wanted to do a book or something along those lines, something a little bit more substantial than we'd done in the past. And we had heard right around that time that David C. Koukl, who's a publisher of several of my dad's books, had purchased a comic book company, and that they were trying to get into original content graphic novels. David C. Koukl publishes the Action Bible, which a lot of people are familiar with. You see it everywhere. I mean, you see it in Target, you see it at the airport. It's one of the best-selling. I think last month it was like one of the top 20 best-selling books of all Amazon. And it is a comic book version of the Bible. So it's the entire Bible from front to end, but adapted as a comic book. And so they kind of wanted to go in this direction. Hey, can we create original content? And because we had relationships with them, well, my dad has relationships with them. Yeah. And because we knew that this was just starting, we tried to get on the ground floor and kind of threw out some pitches. And in terms of the story, my dad will want to give me a lot of credit for this, but he already had really solid plot ideas. I think he came with 6 different possible stories that we would do for this graphic novel. And we kind of combined those into 2 basic pitches, which we pitched to the company. And then the process of actually doing this, we kind of went back and forth. But my dad was very excited about the idea of doing fiction, and I'm a big comic book lover. So the idea that doing something in the comic book space, I think, was like unrealized dream of mine. And so for us, this just really met us where we were at. And the goal here was, hey, can we tell a story? We'll stick in our detective lane. We'll tell a detective story, but that it has a theme that is tied to an apologetic argument. And so early on, we said, hey, what kind of apologetic argument are we already making on coldcasechristianity.com, through our podcasts or YouTubes or whatever? What kind of apologetic material is out there that has some sort of parallel with our experiences in law enforcement? And we ultimately came to this idea that we would write a book about the meaning and value of human life. Where does human life where does the meaning and the value actually come from? Is human life valuable? In law enforcement, we treat it as it's valuable. That's our primary goal, is to preserve human life. But I don't know if there's any cops around me who could actually explain to you why human life is valuable. And so we thought this was just ripe for the picking.
And sometimes, what I understand is talking to your dad, and it's some aspects of these cop films I suspect, are sound, that the discipline or the being a cop and going through all you have to do has a way of kind of hardening you to these kinds of things and losing touch with the value of human life. I don't know, to some degree, because it's just some of the things you have to countenance are just awful and lead you down kind of like a nihilistic path. But anyway, I am curious about, I've co-authored a book with Frank Beckwith. It was my first book that got published by Baker Bookhouse, as it turned out. It was on relativism. And so what we did is we divided up chapters. And so he did some chapters and I did some chapters. I did the beginning chapters and the ending chapters, and then he did the middle chapters. And I just tell him, I just tell them, I talk to people who tell me they kind of like the book. It starts out really good, but then it drags in the middle, and then it picks up at the end. And Frank says, it's so interesting that I have people tell me just the opposite. It's hard to get going, and then it really is great in the middle. So, but anyway, so how is it that you guys managed, when you're doing separate chapters, that's not so bad. But when you're doing what you're doing, you can't do separate chapters. Jay Warner, can you explain how you divided up the responsibilities, or was it just willy-nilly as you went along? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this now we're getting ready to do the second one, so we're kind of going through that process again. So what we typically do,
I saw volume 1 there, so that kind of suggests.
So now we're getting into the next one. So what we typically do is figure out, like, what is the well, first of all, what is this area that we really want to flesh out? And if we decided it's going to be about the value of human life and how it is we ground that, because cops are really familiar with this. We have to struggle with this all the time because, let's face it, there'll be a ton of murders in Los Angeles County today and tomorrow and this week, and most of them you will not hear about. But if a celebrity gets killed, this will make the headlines nationally, internationally. And why? Because we assign a certain value to some victims that we simply do not assign to others. And the question becomes, why do we do that? Like, what makes you valuable or noteworthy as a victim? Is it because you're a certain race, a certain ethnicity, a certain social status, you're an achiever, you're a celebrity? What is it that gives us value? We wanted to kind of chart that. So we decide first that's going to be the overarching principle we're going to mine. Okay. So now the question becomes, well, what kind of crime series might a detective team engage that would expose this issue? So in this case, we decided, okay, it's going to be a serial killer in Los Angeles County, and he's going to selectively increase the value of his targets, at least the value that he thinks they have been assigned by culture. Mm-hmm. So you might start off with somebody that nobody even cares about. Well, really, that's the question we're trying to ask. Is there really somebody that nobody should care about? Mm-hmm. And then we're going to end up with a very public target. And this team of detectives has got to catch him before he hits the next target. And he's doing it regularly every week, and they know they've got a limited amount of time. And we also have developed some questions that they each have about their own value and how they are assigning value to themselves. Okay, long story short, we start with an overarching kind of six-step, six-chapter outline for how we think the trajectory of the story is going to be told. What are the overarching things that are going to be resolved? How will we resolve them? Now, so that we have a good idea of where the story's going. Jimmy now comes in and creates all of the characters. And they're very much similar based on people that Jimmy knows in his career today, people that I knew in my career. Even some of them are probably based in characters that my dad told both of us about, and all the stories that we would hear growing up. So we have some of those kind of character development. And so what's great about it is the day-to-day struggles in the book, the kind of character development, the conversations that occur. Yeah, I might get in at some point and say, let's try saying this a little bit differently. Or what if we said it like this? And then Jimmy can decide if he wants it or not. And so we basically have a script that we began to flesh out, given those 6 chapters of action that we charted together. And as Jimmy was kind of refining that, he would send it to me. And I would kind of give him my input, and then he would either accept or reject it. I always give Jimmy the right of first and last refusal. This is going to be his book. That's why he's listed first on the book, because the reality of it is, I do think you have to be an avid reader in the genre that you're trying to write. Mm-hmm. And it says he is the most avid reader. I mean, we've been buying this guy comic books since he was a kid.
Yeah, I can see piles and boxes.
Yeah,
and boxes.
Exactly. And by the way, he sold probably most of his comic books when he moved into this house. So that's like the leftover collection, and it's going off for 5.
I see 6 wide.
Yeah.
3 deep. So
you're only seeing about
boxes,
a third of it. Yeah, I know.
And I see pieces of boxes on either side, and that's that's only waist high and above. So
that's right. But I think that made him really. He's in tune to what this genre is. Let me tell you how weird this genre is, Greg. You and I, we write in paragraph form, and then typically we have Amy, who is the better version of anyone I know. Like, she gets the right of first refusal. I tell people all the time that my books are kind of have my name on them, but from the opening credits, I always tell people, this is Amy Hall, because it turns out that when Amy says, you might want to try it this way, I don't ask any questions anymore. I just go, yeah, she's right.
She makes us both look much better than we actually are. Right.
But this is a weird book that we're writing this time, because this is really what you're doing is you are writing a screenplay to a movie that is then going to get storyboarded into a book. And so what Jimmy would have to do is say, okay, page 3, it's going to have 6 panels. In panel 1, here's the back, here's the setting, here are the characters, here's the dialogue, here's the action. In other words, you're writing the story not in paragraph form.
Right.
You're writing it like a screenplay.
Yeah, I never thought, I was thinking about dialogue only. I mean, this is what you write, but you have to put it into its particular context. And that's the storyboarding. I hadn't thought of it being like a screenplay.
I think it's hard to follow when you read it. So when he would send me the Google document, and I'd be like just kind of looking at it, and it's like, oh man, it'd be easier for me if it was like a novel form, right? But as a screenplay, you often get like distracted by all the directions that the director has to give, right?
Right. So you do that way, Jimmy, when you wrote this text then, you do the dialogue. I mean, that's the literature there, or the content, the information is dialogue, but then you also have to give information about what's happening so somebody who does the pictures or knows what to put in there, or do you storyboard it yourself with... Are you like your dad? Can you draw and do at least sketches of things?
If only. No, absolutely not. Yeah, we were very fortunate in this case that we got 2 really great comics artists, Steve Crespo and Dario Farmasani, to work on this comic with us. And I think that especially for people who are not familiar with comics, I think this idea of the screenplay kind of works really well. We wrote something for them. Hey, this is what we think is going to be best. But then ultimately the artist is going to need to have their own interpretation of the script. So the artist actually becomes almost everyone else who would be in a movie. The artist becomes the director, the costume designer, set designer. He's the actors, not only what they look like, but how they emote and their posture and all this stuff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So everything is seen through the lens of the artist. And so ultimately it becomes a collaborative effort where maybe I said, hey, I think this page has 5 panels, and with these 3 main actions occurring, if they think it can be done better in 4 or 6 panels, or with 2 actions instead of 3, or ultimately they get to have their own input because they can visualize it in a way that me and my dad cannot. And although my dad is an artist and does his own art in his books, this is it's a whole other beast doing comics art. There's a certain expectation that comics readers are looking for, and there's certain things that work better than others. And luckily we had real pros that got to work for us. So I think if anyone reads this book and feels like, wow, that really was good, it's actually probably more as a result of the art than it was of our writing.
Yeah, well, there's a certain look to the comic style or the graphic novel, and it's kind of gritty, I would say.
Yeah.
It just seems grittier, especially with this kind of topic. I used to read Archie, the Archie series when I was a kid. Well, it's not gritty, but what you have now is drama and stuff like this. As a writer, though, when I've written paragraphs or segments and stuff, and I send it to the editor comes back and makes changes. I realized the editor didn't understand what I was trying to say, and the changes that he made misses my point. Do you ever run into that with the graphic characterization of what you're trying to do, and you say, no, I can see the look in his face there. That's not quite right. And by the way, drawing any particular panel, I'm looking at it right now online, pages of it, and it's like everyone's kind of complicated. It must take a long time to just do one page.
I know.
And then you say, hey, no, that guy's, the look in his eyes isn't right. He's not questioning, he's surprised or something like that. You missed the point. Jim?
Yeah, you know what? This is very true, and I'll just kind of give you some. I don't think we've ever been asked that question, so I'll just tell you that it is true that I can't even say, I don't even want to say how much money was spent by the publishing company to create the artwork in this. But it was, I mean, they took a risk on us. They stretched for us. I think because they knew that we had already kind of invested in this company through Cold Case Christianity and Forensic Faith and all these other books. And so they kind of knew,
well, you have a footprint too.
Yeah.
Not
so
in this genre, but still.
Yeah, right. So they think they kind of stretched for us. But what we had at one point, we did hit a crisis point. It was not because of anything nefarious. It's just that I think that we knew we wanted to. This is not like a normal comic book where it's just action, it's just action. This is action with a purpose. And we did have a point at which we had to stop and say, okay, guys, we need to be a little bit closer to the script on some of these things. And I don't know if you remember that, Jimmy, but we had a point where it seemed like it was, there was maybe a month there where artists were kind of like thinking, I can kind of riff off, this is, I can kind of take it in my own direction. And because we knew the two things, number one, the only cops involved in the process were us. So there are some things that police officers just don't do. And we don't want to have them doing those things they don't typically do in this version of the story. We want this to be realistic. And two,
like most cop movies and TV shows, they don't do the things you're looking at. I know you.
Yeah. So for the most part, you'll see that the people are holding their weapons the way that we hold weapons. They're advancing this case the way we typically. Now, have we shortened it and abbreviated it so it moves faster? Of course. But this is going to. We knew that comic book artists who don't necessarily have a foot in the industry are not going to understand some things, and we really wanted to stay close to those things. So for the most part, although of course they had complete freedom to reimagine, like the character development, for example, Jimmy's had a very well-developed cast of characters, and they were described quite well. And he sent them to the artist the first month of this process. But when we got them back from the artist, now we can see these characters that Jimmy had created. I was very excited by it because it's like, they're casting actors, and we get to see who got cast. And Jimmy's descriptions were pretty robust, but they helped us to reimagine the characters a little bit. So that was fun. But in the end,
basically, you give them some instructions of the kind of character you want, Jimmy, and then they send you a couple of thumbnails of what they envision that character to look like, and then you get to kind of give thumbs up or make adjustments or whatever, and then they can place that same individual in the different circumstances as an actor would be who got cast in the different frames. So you were both happy right out of the gate with the way the characters look, that as you imagine them to be, Jimmy?
Yeah, I would say that some of them are very different than I imagined them to be, but I would say in every case they're better probably than what I had first thought. And leave it to an artist to be a better drawer than at the writer. But I think what was good was that we would get back versions of these characters who looked sometimes radically different than what I was picturing in my mind, but still had the same feel as the character. So that now the plot of the story, the action that's going to occur, what this character is going to go through, it still resonates with this new image. It just looked better. So I would say in almost every instance, I was probably happier with the artist than our ideas, except for when it came to technical issues, like my dad's talking about, hey, make sure this uniform looks a certain way, or etc.
Right. Now the main guy is Murph, right? Murph.
Yep.
Yes.
And I just had this thought when I saw the book the other day at Reality in Ohio, that somebody came up with a book themselves. You signed it. You're standing next to me, and at the book table there. And I saw the Murph character. Now I've seen I saw one picture of your dad in the slide presentation the other night when you had all three of you were standing there, and it just struck me, this Murph guy looks a little like your dad, or that's what it seemed to me at the time. You're both grinning right now. So am I close to the mark on this?
I had never thought of that until you said it that night, and I don't think I've mentioned it to Jimmy. So do you think? I think he does look a little bit like Dad. What do you think?
I think so, and I think what it is that he evokes a certain energy that was probably. When my grandfather actually retired, I think I was like 1 year old or something. So I don't actually remember him during the time that he worked, but the gist I get from his stories and the way he carries himself now is that he probably had the same level of energy or disgruntledness that Murph had Murph is a character who's at the end of his career. The whole idea
Your
with
dad's
Murph,
laughing now, so he must be on the mark.
We definitely wanted Murph to be somebody who kind of embodied a characteristic we see in a lot of people around us. I think one of the best things and worst things about cops is that we take great identity in our work. And this can be really good as an employee because it means you'll give everything to your work and you're probably going to work harder than maybe you would at something else. But it's usually to the detriment of everything else in life. And this can be a real problem because at some point everybody retires. And Murph is in this kind of a zone where as our story opens, Murph has hit his day of retirement eligibility. He doesn't have to retire, but he now is able to retire, and there's essentially no reason that he has to keep working. But he's someone who's taken a great identity in his work. I think I see that, that's a temptation I feel in my own career. I've seen that in the lives of family members, of coworkers, of friends, that when you take such great identity in your work, you're placing it in a really dangerous place because everybody retires eventually. And some people retire a lot earlier than they mean to because they get injured on the job. They have some sort of medical issue that they couldn't foresee. And it can be absolutely crippling to someone who identifies, I am a cop, or I am this particular kind of cop. I'm a detective. I'm a motor officer. And now all of a sudden, because you injured yourself, now you're going to get medically retired. You're never going to work again. And now it's like, wow, who am I? And that's where our kind of story starts with Murph. Is that he's this guy who's got this question now of, he is a cop, but is he anything else? And if it's not his work that defines him, what is it? Where could he place his identity? And that's kind of the launching point. We wanted to start down this road with this question of where would real value, real meaning be found?
Yeah, I want to explore that in just a little bit because it's such an important part of the work. And your dad talked about this last weekend. The talk that he gave it's just so good. In fact, I'm getting a link to the one that you did in Minneapolis for us with 4,000 students there when you did that talk, because I want my wife, my daughter to watch it. It's just in Dallas when they did the feed, I guess you had some trouble with your electronics.
They couldn't get it visual,
like that.
right?
But before we get to that, and your dad tells a story about his last day and turning in the keys and turning in his badge and walking out the gate for the last time, and he spent his last day with you, just on the beat wearing just the uniform, and he said, yeah, we're not doing anything strange today. We're just going to eat 6 different times, check in, check out, we're done with it, because you see all these movies that the guy says, hey, man, I'm about to retire, man, don't rock the boat, and then, of course, the boat gets rocked, and that's what the movie is about. Yeah. But I do want to get to that identity issue because this is the thing that your dad developed so powerfully in this talk. But I'm interested in the craft just a little bit, if I could ask you some more about the craft of writing this. I write nonfiction, and I gather ideas and organize ideas. I get the ideas from somewhere else, and then I find ways to make them more memorable. So there is a creativity involved, but it is it's not the kind of thing in terms of tradecraft that you do as a fiction writer, making a story. And to be honest with you, I can't imagine how anybody would do that. How do you think up a story? How do you invent a story? How do you maybe you get some of the characters and just, start working. There was this wonderful Christmas story about the man who invented Christmas, which is supposedly about the way that Christmas Carol was written. And so you get a little insight into the author working with characters who take on a mind of their own and a life of their own. But I don't know if that's the way it really works. But in any event, it is a mystery to me how you can do this and develop the story, get the pieces that kind of fit together. Do you have anything? And you were the one who did most of the heavy lifting, as I understand it, in this project. Once you got the basic ideas down, okay, here's where we're going. Okay, now you got to fill in a lot of spaces with characters and character development and plot development and here and there and surprises and whatever. What's that like in terms of tradecraft?
Yeah, I definitely think it was interesting because typically when I think of apologetics, here we're trying to make a fictional book that has an apologetic message. But typically when I think about apologetics, I am thinking in terms of these nonfiction, kind of this logical, if I find the right evidence and I order it in the right way, it will lead the reader naturally to the conclusion that I hold, and now we're going to be in agreement. This is how I make a compelling argument. And I love reading nonfiction, especially apologetics. But I think the difference between nonfiction and fiction is that when I'm reading nonfiction, I'm thinking about an idea. But when I am reading fiction, I'm living. It's a more of an experiential thing. I'm in the story with the characters, and so I think there actually is something similar to what you were saying. You were saying, "Hey, when I write, I gather these ideas and then I try to reformulate them." There is an aspect of that because there is a message we ultimately want to communicate about life. But I think that part of the ideas that we're collecting is our own experiences and our own feelings. There's a feeling, or maybe many feelings, that we experience throughout life that we're collecting, and then we're trying to order them in a certain way as to communicate a message through this sort of experiential process. So for me, especially because this is such a personal book, it's about something that we both did in our own lives. I think that a lot of times I'm looking back on the times where I struggled with identity, or I saw someone around me really heartbroken as they struggled with their identity over work-related issues. And so these are the ideas that I'm collecting. The ideas are these kind of visceral emotional experiences that I'm trying to communicate. And yes, I am trying to communicate an idea the same way a nonfiction book would, but I'm trying to use emotion to do it. There's a more participatory aspect to a fictional story. So I think also when you're talking about characters, I'm hesitant to say that I am a capable or good writer, but the goal here, at least for me, was to create characters who were so compelling that I could take these characters and plug them into any story. And because I had done so much groundwork, I had such a good idea of who they were that I would know how they would act in that story. And that's essentially what we did when we very first started this. I think the task was I created 6 characters. My dad created 6 stories, and then we kind of plugged these characters in and mixed and matched and saw how would these characters act in the stories, and then which story is going to get these characters to act in a way that's going to ultimately lead them to experience something that's going to communicate the message we're trying to communicate. So there actually is like a logical, if you want to call it that, flow to fiction,
right.
But the puzzle pieces are just different. They're not all these sort of like emotionless, detached ephemeral ideas. These are more of a visceral feeling that you're having.
Okay, well, part of, I think, and your dad does this so well with his public presentations and also his writing, and what I try to do too, we can take these facts and then try to find ways of communicating. This is the wordsmithing, so they have life to them and they're compelling, and we're thinking about euphony and the way the words sound in our head as we're working and everything. So, and it sounds to me like what you're describing here is there's something similar. You have these pieces, but the pieces relate to something that initially are emotional. Let's say if you want to start with disappointment. I need disappointment here, and so then you get how does this character experience something, and maybe you're drawing from your own experience or somebody else's that you know, that an environment of disappointment, then what does that look like? And you recreate that environment. Am I kind of roughly on the right track?
Yes, you said it much better than you said in like 2 sentences what I tried to say in like 5 paragraphs just now. So thank you.
Look at, I know what that's like because Amy does that to me all the time.
Oh yeah, she does that to all of us. But you know what's interesting? Have you ever read Stephen King's On Writing? Okay, I read that years ago. Okay, so you know what he talks about. Yeah, this is such a fascinating experience. And so what he's doing is, rather than, and I would probably be terrible at this, is I'm always thinking, and this is how I help Jimmy. I make sure that the overarching narrative is chugging along. We're getting there. We're making the points in each chapter. We're hitting our marks, okay? But what King does, and he always talks about this, is that he is developing and creating characters that are so robust, and he knows them now so well, that now he just creates a scene, and he kind of almost as like an observer, just as, let's see how these characters react in this scene. Given what he knows, turn them loose. Yeah. And now they're interacting. What that sometimes means is that real people rabbit trail. And I see in this book often the sign of a true conversation, because it's not written to get you to this goal, okay? Like the overarching plot line is dictating it. No, this is what a real conversation is going to sound like, and many people have written to us and reviewed this online, where they're like going, "Wow, this was so real." And they recognize that these kinds of conversations, because Jimmy's giving himself the freedom to explore and have fun with the character development and the interaction between characters. He knows they're in this scene. Okay, this chapter, we're going to find this dead guy over here. Okay, so he knows the scene, and now he's got his characters that he's developed, and he's just kind of watching how they interact in that scene.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about it. And I also realize this, Greg, as much as I wanted to write fiction, I've put that on. This is probably as close as I will personally ever come, is helping steward Jimmy's fiction, because I think he's the fiction writer of the two of us, and so I think this is where I can help him, just to give him like a substructure.
Sure.
But once he's in that substructure, he's just watching characters develop in real time.
Well, I think Mark Twain made the same kind of observation about his characters, and this is certainly the way it's characterized in I thought was a very enjoyable film, The Man Who Invented Christmas, as these characters from the well-known Christmas Carol are kind of introduced sometimes through other individuals that the author runs into, and they say things, and he writes it down, and now he's working through it, and then they come alive, and they're sometimes it's troublesome when they come alive, and they want to do their own thing. But Jimmy mentioned 6 different stories. That isn't like volume 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, is it? Or you start with 6 different general concepts, and then you worked with it to whittle it down to see what would be in volume 1. Is that, Jimmy, am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, we took those 6 and we tried to figure out, could we combine aspects of several of them together to make because they were we tried to start small, and then there was a lot of back and forth between the two of us to try to flesh everything out, make it bigger. So we combined those 6 into essentially 2, and those were 2 pitches that we gave to the publisher, and the publisher liked both. So we have the first version here, and then the second pitch is what we're working on right now for volume 2.
Oh, I see. Okay, so you kind of went from 6 to 2, and that's 2 volumes.
Yes,
and
exactly.
So you started in.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, there is kind of a to be continued. I looked at the last frame. I read the end of the book, and actually the last line intimates. I don't know if I should read it or not. I don't want to be a spoiler, but intimates, I think, a big thing. What I suspect. I didn't read the book itself, the graphic novel, but since I'm so familiar with the talk that I just heard again the other night, I could see the theme being played out about the theme of identity. And my suspicion is this particular big theme is really at the heart of your contribution to this, Jay Warner. And then, Jimmy, you just ran with it, to map it out and to flesh it out with these characters. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that theme, Jay Warner, and why it's so important?
Yeah, I think this was definitely a divine orchestration. Here's why I say that. Yeah, I had been, as I retired, and you've really known, we've been together, you and I, on the road, really since I retired. So
yeah, well, I kind of got you into retirement, as I recall, over the Houston's restaurant.
Yeah, you were wanting me to retire about 2 years earlier than that. So so
we had a give and take on that one, but
right.
Good.
So you kind of know I've struggled with this all during this time, and really when I saw Ravi Zacharias's the outcome of all of that, it started me really focusing on what is next for me, because it is an identity issue, and there are these seasons. So I've definitely been focused on issues related to identity. Now, Jimmy had his own kind of crisis of identity about maybe a year before. When everyone at some point in your career, you're going to realize, sadly, what we typically think as cops is that we are really irreplaceable, that we are superheroes. And you don't get to bring your personal identity into the job. As soon as you enter the building, you got to strip off your clothes and put on that superhero uniform, and that's how you're going to act during the entire shift with that costume on. And so whoever you are, off duty, like we even talk about that. That's the off-duty life and your on-duty persona. Like these are different people. And so there's an identity shift that occurs the minute you walk into the building, because you're basically putting all that gear. By the time you get the last thing in place, you're ready to work because you're a different person. Then the question becomes, well, who am I really? Am I that guy? Or am I the guy that walked in the building? Like, who am I really? This is an unusual profession, because most of the time when you go to work, like right now, you're wearing, as you're sitting in your office doing this broadcast, whatever it is you decided to put on this morning. The identity you adopted this morning when you got dressed is still with you right now. It's not for us as cops. We erase all that personal identity. We look like soldiers. We all embrace the persona. So this is a struggle, and we wanted to be able to talk about this, and that was probably my contribution to this. But it was interesting because Jimmy, like he's at that point, and I think this is very true for almost anyone who's in the middle point of their career.
Where is that now, Jimmy, for you? How many years as a cop?
I've been there 13 years.
Oh, that's quite okay. Go ahead, Jay.
So you're really at that point where you're thinking, okay, like the shine has come off. We often say that this is the season in which cops sometimes get injured. That 8 to 15 year mark is where you think you're comfortable doing the job, and then you let your guard down, and then something happens. So I think there is that season in that middle of your career where and that's also probably you're at the end of working the same assignment forever, and you're ready to do something new, and you're trying to evaluate who are you. So because that was happening with Jimmy at the same time that I was also talking about it as a retiree, these things did align, and we were able to put them in this book. But I think this issue of identity, like I've talked about a lot of topics in the last 11 years. Nothing has been as sought after as the talks I'm doing on identity. And I'm surprised by that. I mean, I was going through it, but I didn't realize how important it was to everyone else.
Yeah.
And it really is, and it ought to be if researchers are correct. Researchers talk about how identity is humanity's core need. That expression, that identity is our core need. Well, if that's true, it means it's going to show up as the foundational issue. So suddenly you realize, oh yeah, it's all through Scripture. Well, it's not because God is trying to write to you about identity necessarily. It's just that it's so core to human existence that you can find it in pretty much every other topic, because it's a foundational issue upon which many other things stand. So I just realized it's everywhere. So can we explore that here? And here's what we wanted to do, Greg. We know that often Christian fiction is kind of given the B category. Not so good. Well, why is that always the claim against Christian fiction or Christian music or Christian arts? Films especially. And I think it's because we are typically a little bit ambitious, overly ambitious with these projects, because we feel like, hey, what's really important is the data called the gospel. And so whatever fiction we're going to do here, we need to make sure that the most important thing, which is the most important thing, the gospel, is somehow always clearly represented. Okay, that's not this kind of book. This book is going to tickle out. It's like it's basically would be a great stand to reason book, because it's going to put a stone in your shoe. Yeah. But it's not necessarily going to preach the gospel. And this is not all the major characters here are not Christians. And there's one small Christian voice in the book. You might read this whole book halfway through and think, is this a book about Christianity? Because it's not going to be obvious. Yeah. And I think that it reflects the kind of, you said it, it's gritty. Well, look, we see things. And we, as a Christian, if you're on the job as a Christian, you're probably standing tonight in a conversation with a bunch of your partners that is going to be much rougher than your conversation at church. It's going to include language from unbelievers who are in an awkward situation, standing at someone's death scene, and just trying to pass the time, trying to say inappropriate jokes because they're just trying to navigate this uncomfortable, this awkwardness that we're all experiencing, and this dark humor, and you're going to experience some crazy stuff, and we wanted to capture some of that.
Yeah, another way that it's going to be rougher. And I mean, my sense is that I think the way Christians characterize Christianity, you see this a lot in the church environment itself, is overly triumphal.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
Everything's wonderful. But when you get out of that environment, it gets dark. Yeah. It gets hard. And I mean, life is hard, and then you die. I mean, this is one of the maxims I live by, you know, but fortunately we know that when we die, that's not the end, that's the beginning. Yes. And the hardness of this life has been redeemed if we are Christians walking with Christ. This gets redeemed for good things in the future, where neither moth nor rust destroy nor thieves break in and steal. I'll tell you why I think that talk is so powerful, Jim. Is first of all, it's personal. You are very, very transparent, but this is characteristic of you anyway, and in your other presentations. But this is the most transparent you get, because you talk about identity and the difficulty you had. Okay, now who am I? Now I'm no longer a cop. Now what? And it was hard for you. And you talk about your marriage too, and it's such a critical part of your identity. I mean, you were deeply moved the other night. You had a pause. You're authentic and personal. That's one thing. But the points you make are just riveting, and you have the capability, as everybody knows who listens to you, to make them so well. And your graphics dancing around in the background. There's the comic book stuff, you know that, Jimmy. He's got all this. Nobody sees him pushing the button, in his hand, but it's just all happening right there. So he's in his own comic book, so to speak. But it's so skillful. But it's the substance that is so significant in this particular case. You talk about identity and the importance of identity, and there it is in the very first chapter of the very first book of the entire story. And he made man in his image, male and female made in his image. That's the core. That's the foundation. That's everything follows from that, and so and what you do is you address that and more, and how in your talk how people look outside, look inside, and they're not looking upside. So to speak. And it's just a reminder to me, just 52 years as a Christian, and to what are the things that I am putting in the place of God in my own life. We all do it, as you say so candidly in the talk. And so my presumption is that this is the kind of message that, especially because I read the last few lines, that is being set up in the storyline so that you can take it further. And by the way, you mentioned that the gospel is the most important thing. It's not the only important thing.
Right.
It's not the only important thing. And all those who are followers of Jesus, we already have the gospel. We understand that. We've dealt with that. So now we're on our journey with Christ.
That's right.
And all kinds of other important things come into play here, including the material in this book.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and I think that this is. I love the way you put it. That I always say that sometimes Christian narratives can be Pollyannish, in the sense that they assume the best. They want to end well. We want everyone to get saved at the end. I wish that was true. I mean, my dad, Jimmy's grandfather, is not a believer, and I feel like every time he gets close, he takes like one step forward, two steps back. Right. I was just with him 2 weeks ago. It feels like he's even further away than I've ever really experienced him, and he's getting closer and closer to the end of his life. And I'm wondering, like, what's it going to take? In other words, this plane with my dad in it may not land the way I was hoping it would land. I won't know for sure, of course, right? I don't know what his last moments are going to be like, but if I could project where it's heading right now, it bothers me. I mean, it's disturbing. I don't, but this is life. This is the way, especially if you're a cop. Cops are a great example of self-sufficiency. You call us, we don't call you. You call us in because you've got a problem and you want us to solve it. After 2 or 3, 5, 6 years of that, you suddenly see yourself as the solver of all problems. That's not a healthy place to be as a human, because it means you resist anyone else's effort. You have to come in and solve it in 4 minutes, and then I'm going to leave, and I don't want you guys calling us again tonight, so I got to solve it so thoroughly that no one gets called again. Yeah. That kind of power does not lead you to think properly about your role in the world. Where do you fit? And it's an identity issue. So I think that we wanted a book that will move people through. By the way, so much of why, when you say, well, okay, I'm speaking in front of a group, well, the more you transparently tell your story, it's not the data that moves people. Because I could cite, I've collected all the data on identity and how it's formed and what impact this has on identity, what impact that has on identity. That's great, blah, 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 blah. When I tell you the story of how I'm struggling with it, or how this guy in this case struggled with it, well, that's the stuff that draws us. The same way that I remember when Jimmy first mentioned in an interview that his character formation was as impacted as deeply by comics, or at least alongside what he was learning in Scripture. I was like, really? Like, what kind of a father am I that I wasn't even paying attention to that? But that is the power of fiction. And we have to be creators of fiction that move people. That moves people the same way, because if it's not a Christian comic or Christian graphic novel, it's probably going to be some secular graphic novel, which might move you in the entirely wrong direction. But fiction does move people, but you know why? Yeah. Because here's what you were saying about nonfiction and fiction. I was thinking about this as you were saying it. I know we're getting close to the end here, but you were saying that, fiction is kind of like, I look at it this way. Nonfiction is like a cover band. Fiction is like a singer-songwriter. In other words, nonfiction, I've learned to play the instrument. I can play it note for note. I can maybe even twist it slightly because I can give my version of that song. But I'm not the writer of the song. That takes a talent. Like singer-songwriters are really, really gifted. There's lots of musicians. There are not nearly as many singer-songwriters. And I think that's what fiction is. You're creating it from whole cloth, right? You're not just taking somebody else's data and spinning it in a way that makes it more palatable or more enjoyable. You actually have to come up with the data yourself. Like the story has to be yours. And that's where I think that's the difference between this book. And I do think that we need to do both. And I'm happy that we're like at least toying with this area of fiction. And I'll tell you one last thing. When Lee, our friend Lee Strobel.
Famous.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
famous last words.
Before.
Yeah, I know. But when Lee Strobel started writing fiction, he told me, he says, be careful because your audience as a nonfiction writer who sees you as an apologetics writer does not transfer. He wrote one fiction book and that was it. So I knew that that's probably because it's not just that my audience may not transfer, it's that I may not be able to do it. But Jimmy can. And so I'm just really happy to partner with him.
He's strapped with that name, though, so that might bring him down a little bit. Jimmy, your dad has done something cruel. He's given you 60 seconds here to kind of offer your final thoughts, but I wanted to give you the floor for final thoughts on this book and your work and working with your dad.
We talked a little bit about Christian art or Christian stories, and I think that the idea when people approach Christian stories is they go, if they know it's a Christian ahead of time, they typically think, oh, that means I'm going to be preached to. Definitely, if they're not a Christian, that's what they're going to think, right? There's a resistance to it because they think they're going to be preached to. But the reality is that every story has a message. Every author is saying something with their story. The problem with other stories is that they don't have as good of answers as Christianity. So we should be, all the most difficult questions that we could ask about life, the best answers to those difficult questions are found within Christianity. So I think it's sort of on us as Christians. I think that we should be creating good art because our art can say something that's better than what other art can do. So that's my motivator. Whether I'm doing it or not, I don't know. I'll let the reader decide, but I want to do my best to try to throw my hat in the ring and try to communicate the goodness, the truth, the beauty of Christianity through art.
Well, I look forward to getting the book. I when you were talking just then, Jimmy, I was thinking of a Johann Sebastian Bach, Love the Lord, Solo Deo Gloria, he put out all his work, but he was at the top of the heap. He just was unbelievably fantastic in what he could do. And I'm looking forward to reading, let's see, Case Files Volume 1, Murder and Meaning. And as long as your dad sends me a copy, which he's promised to do on the air here,
that's right.
So that's great. Well, it looks like it's been really well received. Just came out April 1st, April Fool's Day. 93% of the reviewers have given it 5 stars. One person said, "Apologetics meets comics, finally." So lots of folks are really happy with what you've done, and I think that you are going to get a much wider readership through this kind of effort than I think most people would anticipate, especially in our field, Jim and Jimmy, because we think, we think we're very left-brained, But Jimmy, you bring right brain to the left brain information and then make it available. So I really hope this really takes off, and we'll look forward to Volume 2 as well. So J. Warner Wallace and Jimmy Wallace, congratulations on Case Files Volume 1, Murder and Meaning. Good to have you on board today.
Hey, thank you, dear brother. You have been such a blessing.
God bless you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, you've been such a blessing to me, Greg. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's really sweet, and it's sweet to see your son coming up in your footsteps, but adding something that you can't add because, he's got a different unicorn, to use your language. All right, there we go, friends. That's it for this hour. Wow, did it go fast. Thank you for joining me. This is Greg Koukl for Stand to Reason. Give them heaven, friends. Bye-bye now.